Well, hello everyone. You're here with Greg Varnell from Wet Tropics Waterways and Fiona Barron from Paddock to Reef. Hello, Fiona.
Hi, Greg.
We're going to spend a bit of time with you today going through a brief presentation that explains some of the things that are going on in the reef space in terms of monitoring programs and reporting programs and the various reports that are being produced and report cards that are being produced, because it's a little bit complex and we'd like to try and simplify it for you. So I guess the first thing to note, Fiona, for those of us that work in the reef space, we see all these reports and we hear all these acronyms and we kind of have a little bit of a sense of what they're all about because we're working in the space. But for people outside of our space, it can get pretty complex. So would you like to give us the quick 30-second overview of what all these reports are about?
All right, Greg, there's a bit of a hierarchy to these, and when you look at all these different reports there, you think, are we just repeating all this information? Why are there so many things there? If you look at these things that we've got there on the screen, there's three broad categories. One of the categories is about science and knowledge. We'll talk about these reports in a bit more detail next. Under science and knowledge, we've got the Great Barrier Reef Outlook Report. We've got the Scientific Consensus Statement. Then another category we have is about planning and management, and that's about how we're going to approach things and what we need to do. The overarching one of those is the 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan, and then we also have the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan. And then our third category is about monitoring and reporting. And when you look on the slide there, you'll see across the bottom there's regional reports. So we've got the Reef Water Quality Report Card, and then we've got the regional report card. So there's our three categories there, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail next.
Right, so here's a bit of an overview of all those reports. You've seen the covers, now you get a bit of a sense of what they're all about. Fiona, let's start at the top. Let's go through the Reef 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan, which is all about planning and management, so it's what we're aiming to do, as the slide says. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what that's about?
So this plan was released in 2015, and it sets clear actions, targets, objectives and outcomes to drive and to guide the short, the medium and the long-term management of the Great Barrier Reef. So this gives some detailed action-by-action progress reporting on the plan and the actions that have been adopted. So that's setting out what we need to do and what we're aiming for.
And then underneath that, we've got the Scientific Consensus Statement, which is a 5-yearly document, and it's really taking stock of the science and knowledge. So it's a whole bunch of independent scientists all coming together from all over Australia, all over the world, people who really know this stuff, have built a career around understanding coral reefs, that go through the process of assessing where we're at and giving us a bit of a statement about where we're at and where we're headed.
Exactly, Greg, and the last Scientific Consensus Statement was released in 2017, and this provides the science behind the Water Quality Improvement Plan. You've already said it's every 5 years, but it gives us the scientific understanding that underpins the design and implementation of the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, and it builds on previous work done, such as the plan that was released in 2013. And the Scientific Consensus Statement includes a risk assessment and management prioritisation. It covers all the land-based pollutant sources, including urban diffuse and point source, industrial discharges. And this latest Scientific Consensus Statement also includes aquatic ecosystems, their status and their water quality impacts and risk and management options for those systems. So the coastal wetlands and floodplains, the estuaries, the marine waters, the benthic marine ecosystems, and it really focuses on coral reefs and seagrass.
All right, let's move down to the left side of this slide there. Now we've got the various plans. So I guess the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan is the next one to talk about. Let's not confuse that with the Long-Term Sustainability Plan. It's a subset.
That's right. It's another planning and management tool, and it's a joint commitment of the Australian and Queensland governments, and it works in partnership with all the stakeholders across the reef, the traditional owners, the landholders, natural resource managers, industry, research and conservation groups, and it's nested in there under that long-term sustainability plan. The 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan was released in 2017, and it's about how that overarching long-term sustainability plan will be delivered. So it gives us detailed targets for community engagement, for land and catchment management, for water quality. It gives us objectives for ecosystem health that will contribute to social resilience and benefits. It addresses all the land-based sources of water pollution, including runoff from urban, industrial, agricultural, public lands. And it does set some ambitious, but they're certainly achievable targets for improved water quality. and for land management practices, and it identifies actions that we can adopt that will help improve the quality of the water entering the reef.
Very, very important stuff for the resilience of the reef. I guess the next one's down the right-hand side of the slide there. These are the condition reports. So these are the ones that are telling us about where we're at now. It's taking a bit of a snapshot of our progress or a snapshot of the condition of the reef. So let's start with the GBR Outlook Report, because that's kind of an interesting one. It's a little bit different to the others, isn't it?
It is. That's produced by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and the last report was released in 2019, and it gives an overview of the reef's condition, and it looks at all the reef health, the pressures and the likely future. So it gives us a bit of a forecast. It's like where we're at and what it's likely to be.
The Reef Water Quality Report card, Fiona, this is the one that is, I guess, probably really public, and a lot of people confuse perhaps with the regional report cards or see some conflicts there with the regional report cards. So let's cross that off and then we'll move on to the regional report cards and clarify.
All right. So the Reef Water Quality Report card, that's released every year, and that's again a monitoring and reporting tool. It assesses the results of all the actions under that Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, and it reports up to June of the preceding year. So the Reef Water Quality Report card that was released in 2019 gave us information on all the actions that had occurred up to June 2018. We need that time to be able to assess and analyse all the data and to make sense of it and give a reasonable report. So the Reef Water Quality Report card is for the whole reef, so it's at a much bigger scale. It's got slightly different detail, or quite a bit of different detail, as Greg will touch on next, in terms of how it reports and what it reports.
All right, well, I'll talk about regional report cards, because I guess managing the Wet Tropics regional report card partnership, that seems to fall into my basket. So the regional report cards, as the name suggests, there's 5 regional report cards in the Great Barrier Reef Basin. So Wet Tropics is the northernmost of them. It stretches basically from Daintree, Mossman down to Hinchinbrook and inland into the tablelands. So what we're covering there is, well, water quality is part of what we do, of course, and we use some of the P2R data in our reporting as well, but we also look at the condition of our waterways, so both freshwater, estuarine, inshore marine and offshore marine, and we're looking at things like riparian zone health, and we're looking at things like mangrove health and fish and all kinds of other things in addition to water quality to give us that full picture. It's more detailed, it's higher resolution, I guess, smaller area and a little bit more focused on what's going on in our region, but it's also looking at the end of basin stuff in terms of water quality. So it's not really looking at where stuff's coming from, it's just looking at which basins are contributing what to the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember the Outlook Report and the 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan cover all the aspects within that reef and landward environment, and the Scientific Consensus Statement, the Water Quality Improvement Plan and the report cards cover water quality and ecosystem health.
Correct, yes. All right, so this is what the 2 report cards look like. So we've got our Reef Water Quality Report card there on the left, the Wet Tropics Regional Report card on the right. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into those and pick up some of those key differences. So Fiona, would you like to talk to us about the Reef Water Quality Report card and what is included in that process?
Yeah, and I think one of the start points is now the Reef Water Quality Report card is an online tool. It's not a printed document. It's an online tool that you can find on the website. So the Reef Water Quality Report card, it measures progress towards the targets that are listed in that 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, and under the Paddock to Reef program, which we'll talk about in more detail soon, there's more than 20 partners that provide information towards the Reef Water Quality Report card. So it's a huge collaborative effort bringing together a massive amount of information. We've got government, we've got industry, we've got natural resource managers, we've got landholders, we've got research organisations. It's a really big effort, and the Reef Water Quality Report card covers all the Great Barrier Reef regions, and the biggest difference is it uses monitored data. So it does a lot of monitoring, but it also uses models to help estimate what possible outcomes. So that's a big thing to remember, that it's monitored and modelled data. Oh
yeah, we're going to be talking about that in a fair bit of detail in just a moment, because that's one of the key things, as you say, that really differentiates these 2 report cards. So the Wet Tropics report card is more regional focused, and as I've said, it covers the condition of our Wet Tropics ecosystem. So it includes not just water quality, but a whole range of other indicators that we use to test how our environments, our regional environments and aquatic environments are performing. So we're covering the basins, the estuaries, the inshore and the offshore. And like P2R, we've got a whole bunch of partners that provide us with data. So the Wet Tropics Waterways Partnership doesn't collect our own data, we use other people's data. Like the Reef Water Quality Report Card, that means that there is a little bit of a lag between when the data get collected and when we can report on them. So we typically report, as the Reef Water Quality Report Card does, on the previous year's data. So in 2019, we reported on data up to June 2018. So we only cover the Wet Tropics region, but as I said, there are 4 other partnerships to the south of us that cover much of the remaining parts of the Great Barrier Reef basin, and we use monitoring data only. We don't use any modelled data, and that's a big distinguishing factor between the 2 report cards, and we'll talk about that next. All right, Fiona, so where does the information come from that gets used for P2R modelling and reporting?
The Paddock to Reef Integrated Monitoring, Modelling and Reporting program, as we've touched on, it uses a lot of monitoring data, so it brings together everything that's available. And the Paddock to Reef program was started in 2009, and one of the key reasons is we had lots of organisations, lots of departments that were doing monitoring, but many of them measured or monitored different things, and they used different methodology, and it was really hard to track progress and what was happening. So that was a big impetus for developing this integrated program, and all that data is then able to be brought together and compared, and we can see what's happening over time. So the monitoring data is then used to be able to calibrate the models, and it also to validate them that what the models are producing is actually pretty closely reflecting what's happening on the ground.
And I guess one of the things that perhaps for those who are not from a technical background might not understand is that just because there's monitoring happening in different places doesn't necessarily mean that it's being done in a way that the data that are being collected can be compared. So part of that process is figuring out how all the data fit together, what they're telling us from the various different monitoring programs, and making sure that we're comparing apples with apples as we go through the process of using those data to report.
That's right, and that's been a massive success of this P2R program.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, let's talk about the modelling now.
So the modelling helps us estimate water quality outcomes from management practice changes. We're able to bring all that data together and be able to estimate, if you put in place a particular management practice course of action, what your most likely water quality outcomes would be from adopting those particular practices. And there's a huge amount of data that goes in behind developing the model. There's more than 28 years of information that is used to average out, likely outcomes, and it includes soils data, it includes rainfall, river flow, climate data. There's a massive amount of base data that helps to inform these estimates that are churned out at the end of models. But of course, the accuracy of any modelling information is dependent on the quality of the data that's put in, and particularly the data about management practice adoption, what's happening where and what are the likely outcomes from those actions. So, it's very much a collaborative effort, and we all need to work together.
Let's break down, Fiona, into nuts and bolts. What is the Paddock to Reef program?
So we touched on that previously, just saying it was a program established in 2009, and it's funded by the Queensland and Australian governments. And P2R stands for the Paddock to Reef Integrated Monitoring, Modelling and Reporting program. So it's doing all those things. Remember in that early slide where we had a whole lot of different reports and scientific consensus statements. It helps bring all that information together and make sense of it. It brings together the work of many, many projects. One of the basic tenets of Paddock to Reef is it has multiple lines of evidence, so it's not just using one source for the information.
So important.
Yeah,
very, very important.
Very, very important. And our stakeholders, they're the nuts and bolts of what's happening in this program. So Paddock to Reef provides a framework for evaluating and reporting on progress to the 2025 targets. The program links on-ground practice changes to likely water quality outcomes. So if a particular course of action, management action is implemented, what might we expect in terms of water quality outcomes? So, and as we mentioned at the top, it monitors, it models and reports on data. So that's the Paddock to Reef Integrated Monitoring, Modelling and Reporting program.
And I'm so glad, Fiona, that we can call it P2R because it's so much easier than to use the full name. P2R science informs the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan. So let's go through exactly what that means.
Okay, so there's all that science that's occurring, there's monitoring, there's modelling, there's a huge amount of monitoring that goes on, and that is brought together in the scientific consensus statement that looks at the impacts, the risks and possible solutions of what we might do to address these risks. The data is used to develop the Reef Water Quality Report Card, and we see that information is produced every year. So there's a huge amount of work going into there to see what our monitoring's telling us. Is our modelling matching up with what we're expecting from our monitoring? Is our monitoring coming close to where our models are saying we will be? So when you look at that Reef Water Quality Report Card, you see there's information from the very top of each of the basins right out to the reef. So there's a huge amount of information brought together there. And then the modelling scenario it's about what we think we can achieve. If we implement this particular course of action in this part of a catchment or in this whole basin, are we going to get these particular outcomes? So it's about what we think we can do. There's a lot of robust, detailed scientific methods and huge amount of work by a lot of dedicated scientists to bring all this information together. And many of them, if not most of them, have been with the Paddock to Reef program since it first started.
Wow, very important to keep that experience in something like this. Fiona, we're going to talk now about monitoring versus modelling, and I know this is a bit of a hot topic sometimes when you're talking to stakeholders, and there's a fair bit of contention, I guess, about modelling, and there's a fair bit of emphasis put on monitoring, but we need both, don't we?
We certainly do.
Let's go through monitoring first. So what are the pros and cons of monitoring? Why do we need monitoring of actual real-time monitoring, collection of samples?
Monitoring is fantastic because it's the field collection of data. It might be soil samples or it might be water samples from across river basins, across a whole river basin, or perhaps just across one catchment in a river basin. So it's giving us some information at what's happening, but it's only at that point of time and for those specific things that we actually measure. If you're not looking for something, you're not necessarily going to find a result for it. It's just because we take a sample, unless we actually analyse it for specific things, we're not going to find those results. So that's really important.
And there are so many things that we could be looking for. Practically, it's just not possible to look for everything. So we have to narrow down, well, what are the key things that we need to know about? And we have to understand that some of those things can change. Some of them might change over a period of days, some of them might change over hours, some of them might stay pretty stable for really long periods of time. I guess that's one of the shortcomings of monitoring, isn't it? People tend to think that because it's a real sample and you get real data, it must be right, but actually that data could be different depending on when you collect the sample and the conditions you collect it under. It's a bit of a shortcoming of monitoring that people don't see.
That's right. It doesn't necessarily capture that short-term variability. You might be taking your samples every week, or if it's a bit of a flood, you might be taking them, every hour. It gives you that information at that particular point in time, but it's really important that you think about what you're going to monitor for and why you're going to monitor before you start taking your samples. You can't just take a sample and go, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, Z with it. It's really detailed planning to do it. It's labour intensive. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about really expensive automated equipment, that still needs maintenance. And if you don't have that really expensive equipment, then you're talking about people going out on the ground and collecting water samples, and sometimes that might have to be really frequently. Other times it might only be every month. Again, you're limited by budget and your resources, and resources being your people power, the dollars to actually collect the samples, the dollars to analyse the samples. So, there's a lot of background to it, but monitoring is great because it does allow the evaluation of some long-term trends, provided you've had a long-term monitoring program in there, and it does provide a point of truth for modelling because you're comparing what's happening in your models. Is it reflecting what's actually happening on the ground?
And that long-term trends, it's a really tricky thing too, because you have to be committed to having a program in place and collecting samples at an appropriate scale, appropriate periods for a long period of time. So it's quite a big undertaking to collect that information in the first place. Then to use it as a point of truth for your modelling, you've then got to be sure that you've collected samples appropriately, that you're capturing all conditions. And I guess the other point I'd make when we talk about the sort of labour-intensive aspects of on-ground monitoring is there's also times where it could be really critical for us to collect samples, but it may not be possible because rivers are in flood or because of the hazards like crocodiles or other things that make it difficult to collect representative samples. Monitoring's great, really important, we really need it, but it does have a few limitations. limitations and shortcomings we need to be aware of. So in terms of what's actually monitored on ground in the P2R program, Fiona, would you like to give us a quick rundown on what some of those things are?
Okay, so let's look at it in 3 scales, from the land in the start of the waterways right out to the reef. And one of the elements is doing some paddock monitoring. And in the wet tropics, we've had paddock monitoring for cane and for bananas. There's certainly at the paddock level, there's measurements taken on water quality, sediment, what's happening when they've put in a particular management practice, what are the results, water quality results we're getting from that. And it depends on the region that you're in. When I say the region, across the reef, other regions have got different focus for their programs. It might be about grazing. The next scale of monitoring is at the catchment. So that's collecting data on the end of system river catchments. Depends where you are and what's happening. There may be some other monitoring going on further upstream. That again really varies. And then out in the marine environment, there's monitoring happening on seagrass, on coral, and actual water quality monitoring out on the reef as well. So there's those 3 elements to it.
Quite a big and complex program to manage over a large area. Let's talk about modelling. As I said, this can sometimes be a little bit of a contentious area, and hopefully we can help to fill some of the gaps in understanding here. Fiona, talk us through why modelling is important and why we need it as part of the P2R program.
Yeah, well, we touched on monitoring and the limitations that we can't monitor everything everywhere all the time, and we certainly don't have the budget to, even if we had the people power to. So modelling, it's able to fill in those gaps where we can't get monitored data, and it does use the monitoring data to check its accuracy. By having models, we have the ability to estimate outcomes from those different management actions. We can assess different options for taking a particular course of action or adopting particular management options, and predicting the likely outcomes and impacts under different scenarios. If we implemented course A of management action, what would be our water quality outcomes from those compared to course B of management action? So you can compare them in those ways. That's really good. You're able to use it for some of those estimates and predictions. We can use modelling when there's a need for scientific evidence to inform how we're going to manage and respond to complex physical, social and economic processes. Nothing is simple and nothing happens on its own in this world. As we've mentioned a couple of times, it overcomes those limitations of that periodic monitoring, and it allows evaluation of long-term trends. You might or might not remember that we talked about the fact that modelling is using 28 years of data as help building that model. So that's a long time. Paddock to Reef program's been going since 2009. There's been other monitoring going on, but the coordinated monitoring under the Paddock to Reef program has been going since 2009, so that's a big difference. We use the modelling to estimate future progress against those targets set in that 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan. So it helps us estimate pollutant load from reduction from changing management practices. It helps us understand if land-based practice changes really are working. So it's important, but the monitoring and modelling really go hand in hand.
They do, yeah. And I think people get a bit fixated on some of the numbers that come out of models, and they get a bit concerned that they're not exactly what they might expect. If you compare them with the monitoring data, there's some differences there. But really what it's about is getting a bigger picture view of those longer term trends. And I kind of like to use the example of it's collecting a single water quality sample. It's like taking a photograph. It's like a snapshot of what's happening right now. So we can look at the condition of something from a photograph. And if you do that for a period of years, then you might have a whole series of photographs that give you an idea of what's been happening in that system over a long period of time. But doing a modelling program is more like taking a video. So you get to fill in all those gaps and you get to see all the ups and downs, and it may not be perfect, but it does fill in a lot of gaps and allows us to get a bit more of an idea. But I guess, as you've pointed out, the most important thing of all is that it allows us to see forward, which we can't see with just a monitoring program. So we can play with the models and go, okay, well, what if we did tweak this? Or what if we did a little bit better at managing that? And we can see how that's going to affect water quality on the reef as a result of these models. They're not perfect, but man, they make our job a lot easier.
They certainly do.
Let's have a look at the targets that have been set under the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, Fiona. And I don't think we really want to go into the numbers too deep, but just overall, let's have a bit of a talk about what this table is telling us.
That's right, and they've set load targets. Remember, we're talking loads here for all the Great Barrier Reef basins, and the goal of these targets is to protect the reef health. The targets have been developed by preeminent reef scientists. The targets are not the same for every basin across the reef. They're different for each basin, so there's different priorities. But for the wet tropics, it's principally about the nutrients and the sediments. The wet tropics produces 45% of the total dissolved inorganic nitrogen for the whole reef. And the wet tropics is only somewhere between 4 and 5% of the whole reef area. It's a really huge generation from a very small area. There's a huge amount of foundational work that's gone on across the reef, and particularly across the wet tropics. The projects focus on these priority pollutants, so dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which we often hear referred to just as DIN, the sediments, and particularly the fine sediments, which carry the furthest and have the greatest impact out on the reef, and then carry the pesticides as well. Based on this work, there's also, the projects like the Major Integrated Project, the MIP. They're doing a lot of work with landholders and monitoring, and it's really a very shared, ground-up project and process that keeps everyone informed. So it's very much a two-way street. But if you have a look at this table that we've got up on the screen, you'll see some of the cells have got an MCL in them. That actually means maintain current load. So it doesn't mean do nothing. It means that we should keep with the management actions that we have, or hopefully even improve them so that perhaps we get a reduction. But we need to make sure that conditions, the water quality in these particular basins does not deteriorate. So the impacts that have occurred in these basins have not been as great as the ones where we can see a bit of yellow and orange and red happening. And so those colours, they're about addressing priorities. It's not talking about the management practices, it's talking about what the priorities that we need to focus on.
Yeah, it seems kind of bad that we get 45% of our nitrogen load to the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon from 5% of the catchment, but it's also a great opportunity because it means that there's a small area that we need to focus on one particular analyte or one particular pollutant and manage it, and we can reduce a lot of the load to the entire Great Barrier Reef. So it's a great opportunity, and love that you pointed out. The fact that something's colour-coded orange or red doesn't mean that management practices are really bad in that area. It just means that there's a greater opportunity there as a result of the way things have evolved over the last century or so.
That's right. These changes have come about from people and what's happening in the landscape, and we've certainly changed the landscape a lot since we've come along.
If we want to have schools and hospitals and towns, we have to change the landscape, so there's always a cost. So Fiona, in the previous slide, we were looking at the risk that the wet tropics region poses to the Great Barrier Reef, weren't we? So it was really about demonstrating that the wet tropics contributes a really large proportion of dissolved inorganic nitrogen and fine sediment to the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon, despite the fact that the wet tropics is a fairly small area.
Today we've only discussed the water quality targets. There are also land and catchment management targets and human dimension targets, but we're just touching on water quality. And we saw in that previous slide the pollutant load reductions for each of the individual wet tropics basins and the colours that represent the management priority is based on the risk of those. And on this slide we can see the total end of catchment water quality targets for the whole of the wet tropics for each of those pollutants and what those loads are in terms of a percentage reduction. And for the wet tropics, these percentages are also the same as those listed for the reef-wide 2025 water quality targets in that 2050 WQIP. We need to remember that these water quality targets weren't just something that started off in 2017. They've built on all that work that went on and from the work that was published in 2013 in the Reef Protection Plan. So it's continuing to evolve as there's more and more information and evidence. The risks, as we saw, it's all about those colours, and this targets actually give us some numbers. When you have a look at that previous slide, and when we look at them within the wet tropics, the Herbert, which is the largest catchment in the wet tropics and quite a big catchment, it's the highest contribution of dissolved inorganic nitrogen and fine sediment for the wet tropics. It's also in the top 5 of contributors across the whole reef. The Johnson catchment is second highest contributor in the wet tropics, and that again, particularly for fine sediment, and that again is in the top 5 for the whole reef. The Russell Mulgrave is third highest in the wet tropics for dissolved inorganic nitrogen. So you can see that, when you look at it within our region, there's a scale, but when you look at it across the whole reef, there's another scale as well. The
wet tropics is a hotspot for dissolved inorganic nitrogen and for fine sediments.
And one of the things is when we look at the volume of rainfall and the intensity of rainfall and how close the reef is to the wet tropics region, that also has a big bearing on it. There's a lot of factors in there.
So Fiona, to be clear, these targets are actually what we're shooting at. So with our management practices, these are the numbers that we need to achieve in our region in order to not have an impact on the reef.
That's right, that's the goal for these. So this is about a load, so a load of dissolved inorganic nitrogen or a load of sediments. And it's important to remember that these targets are reviewed every 5 years, as more information and as progress happens and changes happen on the landscape.
We've done a pretty quick brain dump of a whole lot of information. I'm sure for those who are working in the reef space, some of this stuff might be a bit basic. For those who are not working in the reef space, it might be super complex. But rest assured, there's plenty of help at hand. So Fiona, where can we find out more?
Look, one of your best sources of information is that website that I've shown there at reefplan.qld.gov.au. You'll find everything you want to know about the reef and work that's occurring across the reef. It can be found on that website. There's some really good resources under that. If you look at that web page, when you go to that web page, you'll see across the top there's a bar that's got a few headings under it, and under the tracking progress you can find information about the Paddock to Reef program. You can find information about the report cards, you can find information about the targets and how well each of the regions are doing against their targets, all the different pollutants. There's a huge amount of information you can find there. Under one of the other tabs called Working Together, there's a whole series of podcasts on a lot of water quality work that's happening across the reef. If you go and have a listen to those, they are a great little short presentation. A lot of them are done by folk here in the wet tropics. Some of them are working with the scientists that are working here in the wet tropics, but there's also some of the great landholders that are working in the wet tropics. So it is very much about all of us working together. And then another tab called Resources, there's some videos that are again narrated by some of our wet tropics farmers, and they are excellent, and they're talking about some of the ways that they are changing practices on their farms and their businesses to reduce the sediment and the nitrogen. They're well worth having a look at and a listen to. I highly recommend people going to this website and having a look. You can have just skim across the surface for a few visual bits of information if you want, or you can dig really deep and find out a huge amount of detail.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really exciting and interesting point, Fiona, is that for both the Reef Water Quality Report Card and the Regional Report Cards, all of the raw data, or all of everything behind those report cards, the way they're calculated, the way everything's done, the modelling's done, all of that information is publicly available. If you want to dive into this website, really get into the nuts and bolts of it, you can. If you just want the overview, then just look at the report card pages and you can scroll through there and find the relevant information. But it's all there to be looked at and viewed and used as you see fit.
Yep, there's some great infographics there if you just want to have a quick visual summary.
People want more information, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, you can see there that you can contact me by email at fiona.barron@terrain.org.au, or you can ring my mobile. I'm only too happy to answer questions for you or find out more information, and I'd love to hear from you.
Fiona, it's been great talking to you, and I think we've hopefully simplified some of this and not made it more complex, but in any case, folks, as you can see, there's plenty of help at hand. So please contact us. We'd love to talk to you. Fiona, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg. It's been great.
And we'll see you in the next one.
Absolutely.